I think there's a self-selection pressure for people who are higher in psychopathy to choose to seek powers of position, and because they are seeking these positions of power and they are psychopathically inclined, they're also better at getting those positions. And I've talked about this before, actually. In one of the episodes of my show, I talked about how they try and manipulate people, and I thought it'd be interesting to go over it with you, Richard, because, of course, you've touched on this on your YouTube channel. And so I wanted to put forward my sorts of understanding, and the idea of today is we're going to go through various kinds of behaviours that psychopaths exhibit and try and map them onto politics and
Sounds
see... So I've got some examples. I'm sure we can come up with plenty, particularly in times like these. And so I may as well get on with it. So it's worth mentioning as well that... I should have another link there, by the way, Samson. But psychopathy is something that is neurologically rooted. It seems to be something that people are born into having. And so there is a physiological basis, and I'm going to talk about some of the brain areas ever so briefly to illustrate that, because we can observe neuroscientifically some of the things that are the root cause of why they have these behaviours in the first place. So there's an area of the brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So ventral means just lower, and the prefrontal cortex is this part in your forehead, which is involved in decision making, which is my specialisation, and emotional regulation and moral judgment. And there's reduced activity in psychopaths in that area. And then there's also the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is the other end of it, which is involved in things like executive function, which determines where your attention is focused, and it includes things like working memory, your cognitive control, and also your inhibitions to inappropriate responses, so your ability to control responding inappropriately to things. And so that's obviously very pertinent. And then you have the amygdala, which is a part of the brain many people are familiar with. There's reduced activity there as well, and this obviously has a role in processing emotions, and especially fear, because of course people know it for being the part of the brain that is involved in the fight or flight response, as well as empathy. And then finally, there are more areas, but this is the last one I'm talking about, the anterior cingulate cortex. This is quite important in decision making as well. I've done a little bit of work on it in the neuroscience of decision making, but this is involved in emotional regulation, conflict monitoring, and empathy. And of course empathy is one of the more obvious ones there. But the point being is that it's not just there's a part of the brain where you have that specific physiology and then you're a psychopath. There's a broad network, and all of these different brain areas vary. It might be the case that in certain people who exhibit psychopathic traits, there might be one of the brain areas that has normal function or sort of acceptable level function, but it does very much have a physical basis, and it seems to be a very real thing, even though people use it in a quite colloquial sense.
So hang on. Just to dumb it down from my level. So you're saying that some people might be born with a big nose, for example, and some people are born with a big rostral ventral psychopathy bit. Have I got that more or less right?
I couldn't have put it better myself.
Ventral's huge.
But that's
largely what we're going with here.
Yeah.
Right.
It's something that you're born with, and you
Okay.
can observe it, and in many ways you could measure people's brains and find out whether they are inclined to being a psychopath.
Okay, but everybody's got a nose, even if it's just not particularly big. So presumably everybody's got at least a bit of psychopathy.
Yeah, it's one of those things where there's a variation. There's a sort of a sliding scale as to how much you resemble it.
Right.
It's not because, of course, it's dealing with the amount of activity in the brain. But
Yes.
let's look at some aspects of psychopathic behaviour and try and apply them to politicians, because I think that there are definitely lots of notable examples, and it's actually quite a powerful way of explaining all the ways in which they're wronging the population. And the first of which is isolation, and this is a classic psychopathic tendency to make someone feel isolated from people who might otherwise support them, so they are more easily manipulated. And this can apply to politics in a number of different ways.
I can think of a few straight off the top of my head.
Exactly, yeah, sure, go ahead.
Well, trying to close down pubs, the whole COVID thing, all that sort of stuff.
they can also do it in a more abstract way as well, in that they say concerns around mass immigration are racist. Racism, obviously, very taboo in mainstream Western society, so people don't want to talk about immigration. They would rather talk about less controversial things, and therefore they feel more abnormal than they really are, and this helps control how people view things. And as you can see, the majority of the country here, almost all of it, are in favour of tighter controls on migration. However, this isn't necessarily reflected in how willing the media and the political establishment are in addressing this issue and talking about it. And this seems to me to be one of those things. What do you think, Richard?
It's really interesting. I just to go back, we said in the interview we did in the economics part, the difference between psychopathy and narcissism as far as the genetic component is there seems to be a stronger case for a strong genetic component in psychopathy. The thing with the brains, I know that there is a little bit of a internal conflict in academia where we have the correlation and causation fallacy. So we're not sure, or they are not sure, whether people are born that way or if through the lack of usage of the brain, we might be seeing less activity in certain areas. But overall, the consensus seems to be that it is genetic.
I think that my general position on that is that there's a bi-directional relationship, because you can say that there's a genetic component, but there's also such a thing known as epigenetics, whereby your environment selects which genes are expressed, and therefore your environment is not irrelevant, even if you're taking a purely genetic standpoint.
Which you can't these days, can you?
No.
Like it's kind of it's gotten out of date, that argument. The other thing I wanted to say is, with psychopathy, obviously these things are just models. We don't have like a blood test for it, but as a model of behavior, largely speaking, psychopathy is an American construct, and it's constructed around the American penal system. And so, just to help people think about it, when we're looking at the statistics, they correlate around criminals, people who you would find in prison. So they are lawbreakers, and they tend to get caught. Our politicians, I think, are highly psychopathic, but they're as you know, psychopathy is highly comorbid. So one of the comorbidities is narcissism, but there's a particular type of narcissism. There's communal narcissism and there's prosocial narcissism. So they will hide their narcissistic psychopathy is nasty. Psychopaths you can negotiate with. I worked in the security industry for 10 years. I worked for gangsters and criminals. You follow their rules, you do what they say, they're satiated. If it's psychopathic narcissism, they're never satiated. And they'll hide behind a rhetoric of being for the community, for social issues, for social justice. But that is just a cover for their Machiavellian plans. The other way for people watching to think about psychopathy: highly criminal, very low impulse control, extremely goal orientated. Mm-hmm. To steelman your position and to add to it a little bit, it's probably going to be the case not just that they're self-selecting in the power structures, but the higher up the power structure you go, in order to withstand the pressure at that altitude, they will be more aggressively narcissistic and more aggressively psychopathic, because they're then competing not with us, they're competing with other narcissistic psychopaths. And the consequence of the fall, the higher you go, is worse and worse and worse. So I just wanted to add that in.
There is also a problem with the sort of psychological understanding of psychopaths, and you rightly identified it, is that a lot of it is rooted in the justice system, and it may miss some of the aspects of it that might otherwise go undetected, because people can be psychopaths and not come into contact with the justice system.
Yeah.
Or they could be self-aware and actually make effort to try and mitigate their disposition.
Like me, yeah.
Really?
That was a long silence. They both just looked at me and went, oh.
No, I know what you mean there. I know what you mean.
Uh-oh.
Because I always wonder about that, because if you have sort of psychopathic things going on in your head, I've always wondered to what extent that's just maleness, as opposed to just
maleness.
Yes,
you're coming out as a feminist now.
No. I'm just
toxic masculinity.
I'm just saying when psychopathic. I mean, when somebody slightly irritates you and you get a lot of psychopathic thoughts in your head, but you don't act on them. I always wonder if is that normal for all men, or
I would say so. Yeah.
Yeah, for all humans. So when we're looking at these diagnostic criteria and we're looking at the models, like we said in the earlier interview, it's all culture bound. We can't say that there isn't gender prejudice here from male clinicians and female clinicians against men and against women. We all, it's like an internalized gendered or sexist view that we all have. So we assume that's problematic. Like an aggressive impulse in a civilized society is problematic. But if we go back to war, we'll all happily, my position on it is even nice people will become psychopaths inside of 3 or 4 days of frontline combat as a survival response. Your empathy is going to go down. Your impulse control is going to go down. It's adaptive if you're in the trenches. It's an adaptive response. It's a positive response. I don't want you wringing your hands over the deaths of people. I want you to see the enemy and kill them without thought.
Didn't they do that with the Nazis? They gave them some sort of drug.
Meth.
I believe it was called.
It could be that one.
Pervitin.
America has been running that experiment quite
but it had
enthusiastically.
But didn't it have the effect of making it easier to see people that you were fighting as people you hated or something like that?
I think that was the intended effect. I've not really looked into it too much.
Yes.
Because I don't think giving soldiers meth is a good idea. It's got
said,
some drawbacks, I've heard.
They said some of the officers' notes were like, oh, it's very good and the men's morale is very high, but the next day it seems to be quite low until we give them more. I mean, they're all like Nazi meth heads at that point.
Yes.
But yeah, you would, I guess if you'd not slept for a few days or you're on very, very limited sleep and you've been high on a strong stimulant, then yeah, you wouldn't see people as, you wouldn't be like, oh, this wonderful, where are you from? You just wouldn't.
Patience would shorten, I'd imagine.
A lot.
To be a nice person, you've got to be well rested, well fed, and comfortable. Really,
True.
Those are the conditions to being.
Yes, that makes sense.
Empathetic, really. So another behaviour that is true of psychopaths, and I've observed in politicians, is that of coercive control. And I think this one's going to be pretty easy to talk about, where it's behaviours that deprive a person of their independence and can make them feel isolated. And my example here is the welfare state itself. It's basically a covert means of influencing people. It purports to help people, but as economists like Thomas Sowell lay out, it robs them of their independence, and in many ways it creates a situation of what is known as learned helplessness, in that it deprives people of their agency to help themselves, as well as breaking up the family unit as well, because they're less dependent on their family for income, and therefore you get this epidemic of single mothers that we
so
have.
now we're coming back into something I understand, so the economic side of things. So it used to be the case for all of human history and everywhere outside of the West that you have basically a large family group, multi-generational families living together. And in the Western world, in the last few decades, instead what we have is a massive welfare system.
Mm-hmm.
But what it does is it separates you out from your family because you want to go and get your own flat and your own set of benefits and all the rest of it.
Yeah, that sounds about right to me.
Statism would, that kind of authoritarian statism where people become very, very dependent on the state, would breed the echo of narcissism. It would breed codependence. It would breed people who are very ideologically and psychologically submissive. In fact, they would start to see submission and obedience as a virtue, and that would be one effect of the welfare state.
It would be terrible if that actually happened, wouldn't it?
It would be like a dystopia.
It would, yeah. If only we lived in a world like that, eh?
The other thing with coercive control that I thought of was the lockdowns. So coercive control, I could scream and yell at you to frighten you into doing what it is that I want you to do, but that's quite a high calorie burn. That's a lot of effort. If I can subtly guilt you and shame you, that's much more effective. It's a much better leverage over your emotions and your behavior.
So governments use psychological manipulation rather than force, not because they have any particular compunction against the force. It's just easier.
It's cheaper.
It's more effective. Remember that they have that behavioural insights team, and they actively fund behavioural psychology and decision making. And I know this very well. I've done lots of deep dives into the government stuff, and I know the research inside out.
Who was the response team? And there was 12 people on the team.
Nudge unit. Was
it the nudge unit? And it was something like 8 of the 12 of the response to the can I say pandemic?
That's
to
fine.
The illness, to the virus, they were psychologists. And I was thinking, Where's your epidemiologist? Where's your virologist?
That was the There was another. That wasn't the nudge unit. That was another steering group that sat above it making the decisions.
Wasn't it it was above it?
You on about
Yes.
Sage, are you?
Was it Sage?
It might have been.
No, there was another steering. I can't remember what it's called now. But yeah, it
But it was
didn't.
the primary response, wasn't it?
Yes.
Where the primary.
But they didn't have
government
any epidemiologists on it or anyone with a relevant medical background. It was all psychologists.
psychologists. So so what we de facto know through their actions, not their words, which is how people should rate the behavior of abusers. What are they doing? Not what are they saying? Their response was absolutely explicitly psychological manipulation. That is how we will handle this. We can't force people to do it, but if we can trick them into spying on each other, into guilting and shaming and humiliating people, then we have the coercive control we're looking for.
So if we had a narcissistic mother who was treating her children like that,
yes,
that would safely qualify as a narcissist.
Uh,
And that is what the government is doing.
They would possibly, if the reason she was doing that was that she feared that her children would individuate into adulthood. Sorry to add another layer of complexity, but it's probably more correct. She would be classed as a borderline or a vulnerable, fragile narcissist. So the borderline has abandonment terror. I believe our government has abandonment terror, and we saw it during the lockdowns. So the behaviour was more like that of a borderline. Every time you try, so look at Sweden. They just said, act like adults. If you're fit and healthy, go out, but don't sneeze on each other. Don't drink each other's spit on the bus. Basic things. There's all nice people should do. And
quite difficult these days to be
quite
fair.
difficult. And if you're sick, stay home and don't. That's what Sweden did, and it worked quite well. Every time we showed any sort of agency, adulthood, or sovereignty, it was chopped off at the knees. That's a borderline strategy.
And what do you call it when the narcissism that government displayed in response to the Southport riots, which was to immediately call you names and try and shut you down?
I felt that was probably on the fragile narcissism spectrum. I mean, the guy who was in charge of it is clearly a fragile narcissist. That was very heavy-handed, which is compensatory. So he was, I think, full of fear and full of genuine contempt. He loathes white working class people. He loathes British white working class people.
But he kind of forgot to dress it up a bit.
Oh no, there was very low impulse control. So there we see fragile narcissism, a little bit of psychopathy. I think he did all of that in a non-stop narcissistic rage. So if there's a narcissistic injury, you dare to challenge my authority as your rightful king, punish these peasants. That was why there was fast tracking. That was why there was releasing of real criminals from prisons, because he was in a non-stop, what we would call an emotional flashback, a non-stop for 2 weeks, absolute narcissistic rage, driven by fear, driven by disgust. And his response was outrageously disproportionate. It was violent. Legally, can you say legally violent? The way in which he applied the law was excessive and violent.
I hope you appreciated that segment from the podcast, The Lotus Eaters, and if you want to see what else we're up to, you can always watch us have fun in Lads Hour, where we sort of are a bit laid back, have a bit of fun, and if you want to see all the other things that we're up to, you can always follow us on Twitter. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.